life and journey as a Community Safety Wellness Task Force. So happy to see every face here, and want to also welcome those who are streaming, as well as those who will be watching even down the road if they get curious and want to come see what we're doing. I am Xavier Cason. I'm one of the co-chairs of this committee. And before I pass it on to my co-chair, Marcia, I do want to again acknowledge the fact that when you see us here monthly, know that there's a lot of work being done in our subcommittees, which we are calling roundtables. And so we'll actually hear from one of our roundtables tonight on a town hall they had, as well as some listening sessions, I believe, as well as the work from the members of the North Carolina Task Force on Racial Equity and Criminal Justice. And so there's work being done all across the state and here in this community. And we all want to see our community be as safe as possible. And we know that we all have to lend a hand and do our part. So this is why we're here. This is what we're up to. And I'll pass it over to our co-chair.
Thanks, Xavier. I just want to let y'all know I have missed you. We have not been together for an awfully long time. And I don't get to have the goodness of your company, it takes away my energy. So it is a joy to be in your presence and to be together and to serve this mission of safety and wellness in Durham with you. The value, I think, that comes forth in me tonight, most of all, is belonging. How we belong to those who have come before us, to those who will come after us, to those who are here with us, and those who have been taken from us. And last year, 2021, was an extremely violent year. 49 people were taken violently from this community. It's almost a dear, irreplaceable person a week. And this new year has also seen violence, like a shooting, police-involved shooting this morning. And so if you will join me just for a few blessed moments of silence, that we may sink our heads into our hearts and know that we are nothing without each other, or I am nothing without you. That is my truth. Let us have a moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you. May this year be a new day, a new dawn, a new life for us. Xavier?
It's on you, Marcia.
Okay, didn't know if you wanted to add anything. We are so blessed to have two outstanding human beings with us tonight, to help us understand the great work of the North Carolina Task Force on Racial Equity Task Force and Criminal Justice System. Your work is wide and deep and long and really, really important to the work we do. There's hardly a recommendation that doesn't touch the mission of this task force. And so it's my delight to introduce Kerwin Pittman, who is an author and was the founder and executive director of Recidivism Reduction Educational Program Services and sits on the state's Reentry Council Collaborative. Thank you. As well as this task force, and is now the director of policy and program at Emancipate, North Carolina. It is so good to have you. And we also, joining him is another Task Force, North Carolina State Task Force member, Representative Marcia Mori, who served as Chief District Court Judge for 18 years here, is our representative in District 30 starting in April 2017, and has done so much for all of us and our children. Marcia was absolutely critical and raised the age and in rewriting juvenile code, and is just an advocate for truth and justice, fairness, and equity in North Carolina. And so I will pass it over to you. We have so much to learn. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you. From one Marcia to another Marcia. And I'm the Marcia that followed the footsteps of Mayor O'Neill here. And big footsteps to fill at the courthouse. But it's great to be with y'all. And I really appreciate it. And the work you all are doing is so closely related to what Kerwin and I have been working on at the state level to try and get changes to our criminal justice system. And I'll just give you a real brief background that Governor Cooper in June of 2020 signed an executive order. And the executive order created the Task Force on Racial Equity in North Carolina. And I think if you haven't looked at his order, it's really stunning to see how bold it is, because it's based on data and it's based on racial inequities in our state and the number of Blacks that are killed by officers, the number gross overrepresentation of Blacks in arrests, in traffic stops, of juveniles who get life without parole. And we just go down the list. Underrepresentation in juries, the number in our prisons, and it goes from A to Z on the gross racial inequities in our criminal justice system. It's very bold. We started meeting in June of 2020. It was divided into 4 subgroups, and 2 dealt with law enforcement. And Curran's going to talk about a lot of that on what the recommendations are for changing the culture of law enforcement. And this task force started after George Brown and Breonna Taylor and the horrible things going on in this country, and for us to have a reckoning with our own state. And so looking at law enforcement and those policies and procedures and what we're doing in our prison system. And then 2 of the working groups were on the criminal justice system, the court system. I know a lot of you have looked at the role of SROs. We looked at that. We looked at, from juvenile justice to the death penalty. We were not limited in any topic we brought up. I was the chairman of the court system, one of the court system task force, and we looked at everything from cash bail to juvenile life without parole to what's happening to people in prison. And it's not all just legislative recommendations. It's administrative, what the governor can do, executive orders, and local policies, what can happen, in our cities, in our communities, in our jails, with our sheriffs and local policies. So I don't know if you want me, Kerwin, to go ahead with the courts, or maybe you want to start off on what you all did with law enforcement recommendations. We met for a long time, and there were public hearings across the state. There were 25 members that the governor appointed to this. There were legislators, judges, advocates, defense attorneys, prosecutors. So it was a wide range of people. We're still working. We issued a report in December. There were 125 recommendations from this task force. The legislature looked at some of them, but since it came from a Democrat governor and we're controlled by Republican autocracy, they didn't really honor the task force, but they took some of our suggestions and we got as far as we could. We have a long way to go, and that's where we really need community action and involvement and a lot of push forward, which Emancipate NC is doing a lot of that too. So Kerwin, you want to start with law enforcement and Senate Bill 300?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely start it off. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kerwin Pittman. As as Representative Mori said, we worked on, I know she wanted to call her Marcia, but it's just hard to break their habit. We worked on an array of different topics and different issues. And so we came up with 125 recommendations with subtotal of over 200 and something recommendations. And these recommendations are intended to be not just recommendations, but actually implemented and put into place. So currently right now, as Marcia said, we're in the implementation phase of things. And we're still meeting. And so I'm just going to run through a few of the recommendations because there's so many. And it touched on a wide array of issues. And so the first one I want to start with is recommendation. And some of these may not be in order. Some of them may be in order. I try to put them in order for the most, but I have two different lists that I actually utilize when I speak on the different things that we work on. But one of them is recommendation 120. And this recommendation right here did not make it into legislation. And this right here will be one of the ones I will be pushing for within the short session. And this is the opt-out of federal ban on SNAP benefits for individuals convicted of certain felony drug charges. So individuals convicted of certain felony drug charges cannot receive SNAP benefits. And so to essentially let somebody's kids go hungry because somebody committed a mistake in the past or may have been charged with any type of mistake is extremely egregious in my opinion. And it's something that we must seriously look at and really try to tackle upon, because I can't imagine somebody going hungry because somebody has a substance abuse issue. It's like you're criminalizing the poor even more. One of the recommendations we worked on was recommendation number 1, respond more appropriately to calls for emergency services. It was a reimagining of public safety, meaning like instead of sending law enforcement to certain calls, because we know majority of the calls that law enforcement receive are social related in nature, meaning they stem from social issues. Why not send out different models of individuals who are social workers who are trained to do this? And some of these models we looked at was called the CAHOOTS model out of Eugene, Oregon, and the STARS model, whereas when somebody called 911, somebody's having a mental health episode, that actually sent a social worker who are trained in de-escalation tactics and crisis intervention training to kind of help them walk through the ledge. We know when you send law enforcement, it kind of exacerbates the problem, and it kind of just make things go left and individuals end up shot, in all honesty. And at a minimum, we wanted to dispatch the officers with crisis intervention training. And so the next one, recommendation 2, was to add crisis intervention training into basic law enforcement training. When I got on this task force, I really began to see the mechanisms behind the scene and the unseen hands that was controlling these playing fields. And to be honest and to be frank with you, the commissions, the Sheriff's Standards and Training Commission and the Basic Law Enforcement Training Standards Commission, they hold a lot of power. And so what we wanted to do was really scrutinize these individuals and look at these individuals and how they could kind of shift the narrative and the culture of policing around the state of North Carolina. And so we wanted to add basic law enforcement training to their criteria for those coming in, but as well as make a recommendation for those who are already law enforcement officers to have to go through crisis intervention training periodically throughout their careers, as well as receive mental health assessments. And this is very important. We know and understand that is the stresses of being a law enforcement officer. And so it's no way that you can't tell me that these individuals, some are not leaving away from this job with PTSD, be it they may just had a traumatic experience or just viewing a traumatic experience. And so we wanted to kind of make sure these individuals was given mental health assessments, mental health trainings, and making sure that mental health wellness was up to par. And of course, y'all, recommendation number 5, we wanted to form community safety wellness task force across the state of North Carolina, and modeled after you guys. Kudos, hat goes off to you guys. You put a lot of great work in, and we do not, I wanted to let y'all know that we value you guys' work, and we wanted to uplift your work around the state of North Carolina and create great models like you guys have, and actually implement this across the state of North Carolina. So this was one of the recommendations right here for other local communities to form these type of task force, safety and wellness task force in their community. And we're actually utilizing you guys' format to try to help with the implementation of it. So thank you. Another one of the recommendations was recommendation number 12, de-emphasize drug possession. And so we kind of wanted to de-emphasize low-level drug possession because we know that individuals are being stopped, particularly Black and brown populations, and being arrested for small amount of drugs, even though it is statistically proven that Black and brown and white people utilize drugs at the same rate. But yet you see a heavy influx of Black and brown population being charged with these drug offenses. And so we wanted to kind of de-emphasize low-level drug possession. And so some of the statistics when we was looking at, some people was being arrested for trace quantities of under 0.25 grams. And I was just like blown away. I said 0.25 grams. That's not even a gram. And individuals were being arrested for different things like this. So recommendation 13, prioritize traffic stops that improve traffic safety. So we wanted to really get at the nuts and bolts of individuals being stopped for pretextual stops, meaning they're stopping somebody because they say they got a broken tail light. They're stopping somebody because I can't see your license plate. I'm stopping for somebody because you didn't use your signal. And we know what that ultimately leads to. Statistically wise, we see Black and brown populations are stopped at a higher rate than any other population. And guess what? When they're stopped, I smell marijuana. Now I have probable cause to search the car all of a sudden. And this is what we've seen happen. And so we realize if we just put it into prioritizing stops that improve traffic safety, we would kind of nip that racial bias right there in the bud. And so we also wanted to look at the utilization of consent to search forms. We believe this is extremely important. And so in Raleigh, I've actually been speaking with and spoke with the police chief about utilization of the consent to search form and how important that is versus just an officer saying, can I search your car on body camera footage? Because it is a difference. When somebody has to sign this form and look at this form, and I'm sure y'all know in Durham, because y'all utilize this, it actually gives a person a better understanding of their rights and their privileges. You say, no, you cannot search my vehicle. And so we wanted to highlight that and make sure we uplift that. Recommendation 14, improve consent to search requirements. Recommendation 18, encourage citations and summons in lieu of arrest. And so what we wanted to do essentially is encourage law enforcement officers to issue out citations and summons instead of arresting these individuals for certain things that they shouldn't even be arrested for in the first place. Because we know that a heavy influx of Black and brown population, guess what, are the ones that are being arrested. Number 27 recommendation, and this one right here was kind of near and dear to my heart as being a social justice activist as well and a community organizer, was facilitate peaceful demonstrations and create and update protest guidelines. When these protests broke out after the brutal assassination of George Floyd, what you seen was the people take to the streets, but in response, what you seen to that was law enforcement really tear gas and shower rubber bullets down on these individuals. How do I know this? Because I was in it myself and got caught in the melee a few times. And so what I realized was that these standards commissions, back to the standards commission, y'all, the unseen hands behind the scene, need to create some type of guidelines so when individuals are out there protesting or when individuals are taken to the street demonstrating, that you don't have law enforcement just going AWOL on these individuals and just showering down tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. Because at some of the protests in Raleigh, I actually seen little kids being tear gas and smelt the gas myself. Another thing we wanted to, and excuse me if I'm talking fast, I want to give y'all as much knowledge as I can as the amount of time that I can. So I'm glad it's recorded. So if y'all can go back and watch it, please do. Recommendation 31, the strengthening of use of force practices. This one right here was near and dear to my heart. Why? Because I myself have been brutalized by law enforcement before in the past. But unlike today, when I was younger, we just thought it was normal for the police to beat on us until we actually became older and we said, hey, that's not right. And so that's why I go as hard as I go against police brutality. So we wanted to strengthen the use of force practices. What a lot of people don't know, that it is no set standard across the board for the state of North Carolina, y'all, for use of force. So that means use of force may vary from agency to agency. The use of force policy may vary from Durham and Raleigh to Chapel Hill to Cary, and they do. And that's the sad thing. So we wanted to create a uniform, universal use of force policy that every law enforcement agency will have to abide by. And this use of force practices will require officers to use the minimum amount of force reasonable to apprehend somebody, require officers to use de-escalation tactics when reasonably possible instead of using force. De-escalation tactics include, but are not limited to, verbal persuasion, redirection, creating time, space, and distance, and tactical repositioning and shielding. We also, y'all, most importantly, what we put into place, and I believe in the executive order, if I'm not mistaken, Governor Cooper prohibited neck holds from law enforcement. These choke holds, put a ban on choke holds, right? So law enforcement agency should consider using sample language and policies we provided to have a ban on use of force of chokeholds, because we know and understand that George Floyd essentially died from a chokehold. And so we actually created sample language that can be utilized that will actually put a halt in this sample language, y'all. It looked like it included law enforcement officers should not use chokeholds, strangleholds, lateral vascular neck restraints, and any other tactics that restrict oxygen and blood flow to the head or neck unless necessary to protect the life of the officer. So you can't use these chokeholds, like, period. Like, you're not going to be able to use this, and we wanted to craft this language so they wouldn't be able to slip out of saying, well, okay, well, we used it because of da 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 da. And this also requires officers to alert his or her supervisor anytime that a gun is pointed at somebody. In my opinion, if somebody points a gun at you, that is, in my opinion, considered an act of a use of force. And so what I wanted to do, and what we wanted to do essentially, y'all, was we wanted to catch the officers who always quick to draw their weapons. And we wanted to create a pattern and see those who are using it. But also what we did was a ban on hog tying individuals. So you couldn't hog tie nobody and throw them in the back of a car and they die like that, like we seen happen. So we wanted to put a prohibit on that, prohibit on officers using projectiles against, and this is rubber bullets, y'all. And I don't know if y'all seen how big rubber bullets is, but it is literally, the ones in Raleigh's are the size of a hockey puck. So now, I don't know how many of you ever seen an actual hockey puck or a tennis ball. It is big. And when I seen it, I was shocked. And I was extremely thankful that I didn't get hit when they shot that into the crowds when we was out there demonstrating. So we wanted to prohibit law enforcement from using force, projectiles, to the head, neck, face, spines, and anywhere where deadly force is utilized. And so this is one of the recommendations. Another one of the key recommendations, y'all, that I really, really specifically wanted to see put in place is recommendation 32, require officers to have first aid kits and render aid. And I wanted this one put in place specifically because the incident that happened in Burlington where law enforcement rolled up on a guy that had a shotgun. The guy had a shotgun pointed down. They shot this guy, and after they shot him, and he fell to the ground, bleeding out. Nobody rendered aid to this man. They let this man bleed out and die right there in the street. And it just hurt my heart that they wouldn't try or even attempt to save this man's life, right? And so I wanted them to be held accountable for not attempting to save somebody's life. And so in order for you to do that, you can't say, well, I don't got no first aid kit. So require all of them to have a first aid kit in your car. But not only that, require them to render aid to these individuals, just like they will render aid to their comrade, their fellow partner. Right? Because everybody's life is precious. I don't care what, everybody, they ain't got to be an officer for their life to be considered not precious. Recommendation 33, enact agency policies requiring a duty to intervene and report excessive use of force and abuse to others. And now this was in Senate Bill 300. Senate Bill 300, I don't know how familiar you guys are with it, but it's a bill that we worked and fought tooth and nail for. And I take my hat off to Marcia and those who fought, Andrea, those who fought in the General Assembly beside us. Like it was a lot of pushback in this bill, and we gained some great things and some things we didn't get, in all honesty, but that's not the end of it. And now they know that we will not be quiet and sit down. But some of the things in Senate Bill 300 specifically was this agency required a duty to intervene. So officers now have to intervene if they see another law enforcement officers using excessive force. So now they are held accountable for not holding their partner accountable, right? And so that was one of the components we wanted to put in place, but also they have to report excessive use of force to a database. This database, I wanted to be made public, but it was made private. And so we still got work to be done, y'all. We still got, things we got to put in place. And that was one of the things. And that was the define and collection of use of force data in this database. And of course, I realized and I learned how much power the Conference of District Attorneys have. I realized how much power the Sheriff's Association have, right? And when you think about it and it strikes you, it's 100 counties in North Carolina. It's 100 sheriffs in North Carolina. That means they populate the whole state of North Carolina. So why wouldn't the Sheriff Association be powerful? To go in the General Assembly and see how powerful these guys is when lobbying for different stuff, it amazed me. And I knew at that point, from that point forward, that these would be the individuals that we would have to really keep on our radar. But So we wasn't able to get the database made public, but they do have a database. And so that's a whole nother fight for another day, y'all, that we gonna fight. Increased transparency about officer discipline and decertification. And so we wanted to have a database with officers who was disciplined as well as who was decertified will be put in this database and it will be made public. They didn't make it public, they made it private. But what this did essentially was stop the wandering cops. So somebody couldn't come from Michigan who was fired down here and get a job down here in North Carolina. Because they would be put in this database, essentially that law enforcement could look into this database and see, hey, you know what? This guy was fired in Michigan. Before this provision was not even put in place. So this is what you had, what we call the wandering bad officer or the wandering bad cop. And so we wanted to capture that, but we wanted to make it public, but we didn't get it public, but we got it put in place, y'all. So that's a whole nother fight for another day that we will be fighting. Strengthen the ongoing developments of a statewide law enforcement accreditation program. Y'all, this accreditation program is so important, right? Because in order for agencies to receive certain funding federally, they have to be accredited, meaning they have to live up to these standards and guidelines at a minimum, right? Every police department and sheriff's department in the state of North Carolina is not accredited. You have some that are accredited, but some are not. And so what we wanted to do was capture a statewide accreditation system, right? So we wanted a statewide accreditation system so everybody can opt into and participate in this accreditation system. And if you don't, then guess what? You don't receive some money for certain things, right? And so what we wanted to do essentially was create a standard in a lot of different areas that these agencies had to go through in order to keep their accreditation every year, right? So that's one of the main important things. Even with the prison system, right? It's an accreditation for the prison system. And so we want to make sure that every prison is accredited because you got some prisons in the state of North Carolina that's not accredited and some of them are. Right. And it is more that are not accredited than actually are accredited. So that's another thing we're looking into right now. Mandatory body. Let me see how much time. I'm gonna do a time check, y'all. I'm gonna go for about another minute or two. But mandatory recommendation 47, mandatory body worn cameras for all law enforcement agencies. This was another one that was near and dear to my heart. Why? Because I felt like if we had the body camera footage, then we would be able to see what was going on. And we know and understand that without the people recording what happened to George Floyd, without this footage, we probably wouldn't even understood and knew what would happen. And these officers wouldn't even have been held accountable. But we want this body camera footage when there's not individuals out there to record. But guess what? In the state of North Carolina, every agency don't have body cameras. They're going to say, guess what? We can't afford it. So if you can't afford it, I wanted to come up with some type of way, being to getting funding from the GCC, the Governor's Crime Commission, to fund for every law enforcement agency to have body cameras, but not only have body cameras, but have them recording, but also give us access to the footage. So in Senate Bill 300, we had a provision in there to where, and this is where the Sheriff Association, and not to call no names, but Eddie Caldwell really came in and controlled the show. And put this provision, we took it out of the bill, put this provision back in the bill. It's not to step on your toes, Marcia, because I know you probably gonna speak a little bit about that. But yeah, it's crazy. She's gonna speak a little bit on that, y'all. But that was crazy. We wanted to expand the use of dashboard cameras. We wanted to recommend changes to in-service training. So we wanted them to have different types of trainings every year, such as the mental health training every year, such as mental health assessment tests, such as ethics, community interaction, implicit bias, and racial equities. And why I say y'all these trainings, I was one of the ones who was like, man, them trainings don't work. Man, them trainings, but once you give somebody the training and they say they went through it, it's no reason for you not to utilize it. What's going to be your excuse then? Because you said you went through the training, you signed up paperwork, you certified in. So if you don't want to utilize this training, that means you knew it because you said you knew it. You should have been listening to it, but you just chose not to use. So guess what? Now it's an accountability mechanism put in place once they take these trainings. And so that's what I wanted to capture with that one. That's what we wanted to capture with that one, with the use of force trainings, implicit bias, de-escalation training, duty to intervene training. Another one, y'all, I'm gonna do this one, I'm gonna shut it down. Recommendation 105. Now, I myself, going through the criminal justice system, was formerly incarcerated in the criminal justice system, did a significant amount of years inside Department of Corrections facilities. did a number of years. And so I know the prison system like the back of my hand, from down to transfers, from down to the DHO, the disciplinary housing unit, the racial biases that go on in there, down to using a confidential informant, down to locking somebody up for smoking a cigarette. So I wanted to use my expertise to specifically highlight the racial biases taking place inside of the prison system. And so recommendation 105, transform the use of restrictive housing, y'all. They will put you in the hole for anything. If anybody knows somebody in prison, you done heard some stories about them going to the hole, or somebody they know going to the hole for some bull and being in there for a long time. So we wanted to limit the use of restrictive housing, require hard limits on the number of hours and days a person can spend in restrictive housing. And I myself spent a substantial amount of time because I went into the carceral system young in restrictive housing. The longest time I did in restrictive housing, one time I did 1 year. 365 days in a room the size of a bathroom I did in restrictive housing. The guy beside me in the cell actually went crazy, and I couldn't hold a conversation with him after 4 months, but he had been back there 2 years prior to me even getting back there. So I know the effects of this type of isolations plays on the psyche of somebody, especially if they already have a mental health condition. It just exacerbates the problem. And so we wanted to put the Mandela rules in effects for this in restricted housing for people under 21, pregnant women, in with the diagnosed, diagnosed with serious mental illness, substance abuse disorders. And I want to talk about recommendation, and it's a host of other recommendations slated towards the Department of Public Safety, DPS, the prison system. Specifically. So if you can look them up, it is extremely important to know, and know that we will be fighting, and know that DPS is at the table, and we're making sure that they implement these changes inside this system. Also, as well as the last one, y'all, is recommendation 106, the protection for pregnant individuals in jails and prison. This law was passed. This is the Dignity Act. My comrade, Christy Puckett-Williams with the ACLU, me and Muffin Freedom Fighting Partner, she fought hard tooth and nail for this provision to be put in place for those who are pregnant, not to be put in shackles, restraints, and it was a host of different things, man, great measures. Particularly, this was actually signed into law, and it's called the Dignity Act. So if y'all could check that out, man, and make sure that individuals who are not adhering to these laws are held accountable, because now they on the books. So just like they're gonna hold me and you accountable for a law we break, we got to hold them accountable and create laws that hold accountability for them. Again, y'all, my name is Kerwin Pittman. I thank y'all for y'all time, and I thank y'all for having me. I wish I had all day to explain all these recommendations to you, because every one of them is near and dear to my heart. But now I'm gonna turn the platform over to my freedom fighting partner, comrade, Marcia. Thank y'all.
Wow, that was great, Kerwin. He was one of the most dynamic members of this task force, and he pushed and pushed and pushed, and we're going to keep doing it. And if any of you want to see it, I mean, it's a published report. Go to the Attorney General's website, ncago.gov, and you can get it. You can download it. There's a summation, the executive summary, or the big report. And you can get a lot more details about all these recommendations. As we said, there's at least 125. What I'm going to do is tell you just a little bit about the recommendations that came out and what actually went through the General Assembly and was passed, and what we need to keep pushing on, if that's okay. One of the recommendations, we got to shrink our criminal code. I mean, you know, we have all these city ordinances that are class 3 misdemeanors. And you get charged with that, you don't get a lawyer because that's a class 3 misdemeanor, but you could get a bond. And so we're going to look at these class 3 misdemeanors, city ordinances, to try to make them infractions. That would be thousands of charges that would become infractions, and nothing you would be eligible to get arrested for. That was passed, but it's a study. So we got to keep pushing that these nonviolent city ordinances, urinating in public, you know, second-degree trespass, profane language, these need to be infractions, nothing someone could go to jail or be arrested for. So at least that was passed as a study. It wasn't far enough. Starting with juvenile justice, and I introduced 14 bills, and a lot of them mirrored exactly what the TREC recommendations were. You know, as a judge, I saw 6-year-olds in a courtroom. They had no idea what was going on for school offenses. So I introduced a bill that it should be, and the trek was raise it to 12. No one under 12 should be in a juvenile courtroom. If they need help or counseling or mental health services, go to social services, go to mental health. Let's help them outside of a courtroom. The TREC recommendation was the age of 10, and it was part of a bill. It was passed. So we took a half step forward. So 6, 7, 8-year-olds will not be in the juvenile justice system anymore. But if you're 8 or 9 and you are thought to have committed a felony, for some reason they say, oh, well, now you have the mental capacity. So if it's a felony A through G, they could charge an 8 and 9-year-old in juvenile court. 6, 7, no longer in juvenile court, which is great. We have to keep working on 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds. Other states have raised it, so we took a half step, hopefully in the right direction, but we haven't gone far enough. A lot of you have talked about SROs. What's the role of the SRO? I introduced a bill and TREC recommended that SROs shouldn't be able to file petitions in juvenile court unless a school administrator signs off on it too. We thought that takes it out of the role of police in the schools. The principal, assistant principal has to agree before a petition goes to court. That was not passed, but it's still being discussed. We're trying to get the SROs more in a role of protecting the perimeter of the school, but not policing within the school. Get more resources of social workers, mental health professionals in the schools to help these kids. But that was a big debate on the role of SROs, and it's continuing. So we need your leadership and thoughts on that. We changed the law about if a juvenile 16 or 17 is charged with a felony, it was automatically transferred to the adult system. It's now only A through G felonies. So the DA can say, even though it's 16 and 17, it's a felony, we want to keep them in juvenile court and handle them there. So that's discretion, and that's good, but we wanted any DA to have discretion to keep kids in juvenile court rather than in the adult criminal system. We're still working on that. Durham has always done a good job about first appearances. We always try and do it the very next day after someone's arrested and hasn't made bond. But we don't have in our state law a minimum time if it's a misdemeanor for someone to go before a judge. So we've had people 30 days in jail on a $500 bond for a shoplifting. We did pass the law. 72 hours, they must appear in front of a judge after they've seen a magistrate if they can't make bond. I wanted 24 or 48 hours, but there's compromise. It's 72 hours. We're still going to fight to get that down to 48 hours. You must be able to see a judge. You're losing, your family. You're losing your job. You're losing on a $1,000 bond for misdemeanor larceny. You're presumed innocent until found guilty. We also made a recommendation in TREC to abolish cash bond on misdemeanors. And this was the recommendation passed by this task force. General Assembly would not take up my bill, House Bill 210. They wouldn't even let it go to committee. But it will be a discussion, and we're still pushing, and we need your help on your thoughts on abolishing cash bond for nonviolent and misdemeanors. It's what fills up our jails day in, day out. Decriminalize marijuana, as Kerwin said, is 4 times as likely for a person of color or Black to be arrested for small amounts of marijuana than a white, even though we all use it, or some of us use it equally. There is a push to get medical marijuana legalized, and so we're trying to tack it in these small amounts under 1 1/2 ounces to make it an infraction. Decriminalize it, maybe not legalize it yet, but decriminalize it. It has not been done, but that's top on the table, and we're going to still push on that. There are over 100,000 charges every year in this state on Schedule 6 possession of paraphernalia or less than 1 1/2 ounces. So many people start a criminal record because of that, and we want to stop that disparity and inequity. They want long-term funding of drug courts and mental health courts. That passed. We're really working on the right to drive, that if you owe fines or fees, that you should be able to get your driver's license back, do more of an ability to pay, quit punishing people because of poverty, that you don't get a driver's license revoked simply because you couldn't pay the outstanding fines and fees, and move more towards an ability to pay in the court system and also with Department of Motor Vehicles. And we're still working on that, and that'll come up in the short session. And the same thing with failure to appears. People get arrested for failing to comply, failure to appears. We're trying to strike that automatic doubling the bond if you fail to appear on a court date. That was not part of it, but that's something we're still working on really hard. We're trying to reinstate the right to counsel. If you're arrested on a city ordinance or a class 3 and your liberty's taken in a jail, you should have an automatic right to counsel. And that first appearance should be a critical stage of the proceeding, which right now it isn't. They don't consider, oh, you're in jail when you go before a judge. That's not a critical stage of the proceeding. We're working to change that to make sure people are represented by counsel when they go before a judge and they talk about their presumption of innocence and why they can't make a cash bond. There were a lot of things about equity with juries and do they fairly represent the community when you have all white juries and you have an African-American defendant, is that, a violation? Trying to expand the jury pool, trying to expand racial equity training for every person in the court system. As Kerwin was saying, we did it for mental health for law enforcement. We also proposed that all law enforcement have racial equity training. That was taken out. They have mental health, but not racial equity, which, is a no-brainer for these people going into that job. We're going to still push on that. We did some, and I know some of you are interested in restorative justice, to really press and get DPS and look into restorative justice, to try to lift up, heal victims and have dialogue, to get restorative justice that we feel is so important, from the most minor crimes, if there's a victim, to murder. That is lasting healing. And so we really are looking into that. We recommended to abolish the death penalty because it is just in a racial disparity, grossly racially disparity. We haven't had any death cases recently, but they're still pending. And so we want to rid North Carolina of the death penalty. We had a proposal to get rid of juvenile life without parole. And that means any juvenile under the age of 18 can no longer be sentenced to life without parole. It's in tune with what the Supreme Court has said. We still have it on our books. It got into committee, but it did not pass committee. We're pushing really hard on that. One thing the governor did, and I said, not everything is legislation. A lot of it is recommendations for your local governments, your local law enforcement, to use discretion the right way and be aware of the problems in our criminal justice system. And the executive, as Kerwin mentioned, the governor has a lot of power over our prison system, and they can do a lot more with how they give out infractions, how they count infractions, how they can do work release. We need to beef up our parole board. They're grossly behind in hearing cases. But the governor did appoint me to chair up a juvenile sentencing review board. And we are looking at over 300 kids who are under the age of 18, who have been in prison for 15 to 20 years, to see if they should receive clemency. So these are kids who have been in prison more than half their life. Many have been in there 30 or 40 years. And we have started this process. We've met 3 times. We've gone through 25 cases. We've made recommendations. And most of these recommendations are for the governor to grant clemency. And these are tough cases. These are usually murder cases. But we feel that there is mercy in our justice system, and any 15, 16, 17-year-old who has spent over half his life or her life, 20, 30, 40 years, there should be some redemption and there should be some forgiveness. We haven't heard any decision by the governor yet. we're waiting, and we're hoping that'll come through. It's all more or less, confidential in terms of names, but we have the Wilson Center at Duke helping us with this. We have law students all over the state. We have advocates representing 300 of these juveniles, and I have a stack of petitions going through them every week, making recommendations. So, that's an executive function that we really want to keep pushing and finding a little more mercy in our justice system. I haven't highlighted everything. That's just kind of an overview, but I just want to say, and what Kerwin said, Durham's leadership in this and your committee is what we're hoping most communities will adopt. And your voice, we're going to keep going until the end of 2022. And we have a short session coming up, and the more advocacy we have, or your thoughts, you may not agree with some of the things we've said, or, help us push the things that you think are important, because that, the grassroots is where it comes from. We're just carrying your voice. All of the meetings we had, all the public hearings are online. The Attorney General's website has all of them. You can go to them, and I'll be glad to answer any questions, but it's great to be with you all, and really, really appreciate it. And Kerwin, great to be your partner in this.
Thank you so much. That was magnificent. To shrink our criminal code and to expand our compassion and mercy to one another is a beautiful formula, and one that I hope every single roundtable, I hope every single one of us reads all these recommendations, discusses them, and let's see how we can support this great work. I guess it's my age, but when I first read the executive summary, and I was just blown away. It was like a dream come true. I never really believed we could get this far in my lifetime. And so it's really quite, in my view, quite exciting and extremely hopeful. And I know we do have a question. Would Councilwoman Javiera, would you like to give your question?
Yeah, I just was curious, for those of us who aren't legal experts, could you actually give some examples of like what would, because you listed, okay, it could be listed as a felony. I'm just, as a former educator and a parent, just thinking about where children are developmentally, right? And where their brain development is. And so I just wanted an example, because I feel like those kinds of stories, because we all, as a parent, our kids have all done really bad things, right? Things that, you're like, well, but you're learning. And so I think that that's the part that folks really miss, is like, we're talking about a kid who's 8 who did whatever in school. And when you have that context, I think it humanizes what's happening.
Yeah. Hey, Javier, you mean like, what could an 8 or 9-year-old still be charged with?
Exactly. Thank you.
If they picked up a pair of scissors and stabbed a kid in the shoulder, that could be considered assault with a deadly weapon, inflicting serious injury. That could be a type of a case that could be petitioned to court because they didn't exclude that offense on an 8 or a 9-year-old. So mostly something with a serious injury, probably something with a gun that rises to a felony, possession of a gun by a minor or discharging a gun. It would have to be a much more serious offense, not simply stealing something off the teacher's desk or a cell phone, or those are misdemeanors. There are about 1,100 charges that happen over a 3-year period that are felonies for 8 and 9-year-olds that still could possibly be charged in the future. We're still pushing on it, and there is the task force on juvenile justice, and they're still recommending we raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to 12, and 10 and 11-year-olds also get treatment and not get court punitive sanctions. So we're still working on it.
Thank you.
Mike, and then we need to finish up. Did you have a question, Mike?
Yeah, I've got a general question. A number of the recommendations are recommendations that local entities, DAs, law enforcement agencies, courts can implement, while state action comes. So how has the task force shared all the big set of recommendations, but especially the ones that are more that are recommendations for local action? Did you share them with all the DAs, with the public defenders, with the Sheriff's Association? Because especially, I know on the roundtable that I serve on with Marcia on the criminal legal system, we're very interested in those. We want to really echo a lot of those and build on them. And in discussions with the DA, with the public defender, et cetera, it would be nice to know how aware they are and supportive or resistant they are to those whole sets of recommendations that are more dependent on their action or not waiting for the state to tell them what they must do.
I'll answer it.
Yeah, go ahead.
To my knowledge, it was a host of stakeholders that came to the table and that we shared these recommendations with. And of course, different entities put out their own recommendations. Some were right before ours, some after our recommendations. But for the most, depending on the entity, depends on kind of the pushback. And I can't speak for the district attorneys, but I can say for the Sheriff Association, the response has not been so great, majority as a whole, to our recommendations. They actually put out their own set of recommendations. Some of them was counterproductive to ours. Some of them took small fragments of our recommendations and kind of watered those down and assembled it. So we are reaching out to all stakeholders to bring them to the table, because we know it's going to take everybody to fix the racial biases within the criminal justice system. We can't just make recommendations and the district attorney just say, hey, you know what, we ain't doing none of that. And I think Marcia had a little bit more to add as well.
Can't top that. But Mike, if you do look at the report, it does say at the end of each recommendation, where is the action? And it says either local policy, state policy, legislative action. So if you go through it, every recommendation says, if it's local policy applicable. Yeah,
we're certainly honing in on those, what we can do on our end. But I was just curious as to who those stakeholders were, how they have received them, or how they've been made aware of them, and what the response so far has been. So that helps to let us know what to expect.
Every community is so different. We are so lucky to be in Durham and on the forefront of this. Right, Muffin?
Marcia, Owen, could I jump in for 2 seconds?
Yes, I was just going to thank you for your good comments in the chat for guiding us through this.
All I was doing was telling people where it was.
All right, well, thank you.
The only thing I was going to throw out there, to Mike's point, up until the end of last year, sat on the statewide board for the County Commissioners Association, right? And so when the TREC recommendations came out, one of the things that we did, we had Jasmine McGee to actually come and make a presentation to the subsidiary, which is the North Carolina Association of Black elected, Black county officials. But what we did as a board, now that's everybody, that's all 100 counties, and there are a lot of Republicans in there, and I don't mind talking about my colleagues. It was a knockout, drag out fight, but we actually did put a motion on the table for the board to send out all 125 recommendations. If you all talk about being in a backdoor room where nobody wanted these recommendations to get out, and it had been a press conference in Wilmington, I say all that to say, what we're doing now, we couldn't get the big board to do it, like they would not. And that's insane to me, because Representative Mori and Kerwin can actually sit here and tell you that the president of the association at the time was actually one of the people that was on the TREX board, which was Maurice Swift. You would have thought this is your last action as president. We should be able to get all the counties to get on this. And the excuse that they gave was, all of these recommendations are not recommendations that come from the county. Duh, we know that. That's why it says what action can be taken and who can take it, but they didn't. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the Black County Commissioners Association level is at least get those officials, the Women's County, to say, okay, can you get your board to at least put this on consent agenda where everybody has a read it and the community has it. So if that's something that people are willing to do, I would also say, try to go through some of your auxiliaries, like the league. Okay, they might not want to set it out, but there's a women's league. And do you, get, I don't know, Javier, you might be active, but I know Deidreana was active on the women's league. So that's just an idea. And so we're going county by county, trying to get everybody to read these recommendations. But that's just my 2 cents. But it was, knockout, drag out fight. and they did not want to vote on it. And we got voted down. It took like 3 hours, but we got voted down and they just didn't want to do it.
Thank you. And I'll turn it to you, Xavier.
Do want to just acknowledge a third question that was in the chat from Wanda. Any movement on misdemeanor diversion? And then we'll move on. Any movement on misdemeanor diversion for our guests?
Not specifically. In Durham, we started the misdemeanor diversion program before we raised the age, and we raised it up to 21. So I hope we keep doing that, because that first criminal arrest, even if it's a not guilty, can tie up your life for a long time. There was nothing at the state level or in the TREC recommendations on a statewide misdemeanor diversion program, but it's not a bad idea to try and replicate it throughout the state.
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. Again, I concur with all the great kudos in the chats that are in the chat, as well as the just a acknowledgement that this work is part of a larger movement in our state. We're glad to be a part of it. Do want to move on to one of our own subcommittees, a roundtable for not from crisis response. For first of all, with apology to them, this is their third time being on the agenda, and finally getting to report. So we want to go ahead and make way for them. Do want to also mention that we are asking all roundtables that when recommendations come from their work, that we give it a first and second reading. So just want to let everyone know that what that means for us is that we're going to hear what the recommendation would be, and then in our next meeting have more discussion about it before anybody would take a vote, to give us all a chance to understand what's happening and also give space for public comment if necessary. So I want to pass it over to the Crisis Roundtable.
I could begin us.
Manju, did we decide who's running slides?
I'd be happy to. Want me to?
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you. That's secretly my preference because my monitor has been being weird. So thank you. All right, so we put together some slides to share out, and I feel like my roundtable members are going to be doing the bulk of the meaty work here. Let's see, are you able to, here we go. Hey, awesome. But I'll get us started real quick, since the first few slides are just some basic demographics. So to remind folks, our roundtable, we're the 911 Crisis Response Roundtable. It is myself, Manju, Isak, and Shanise, with regular support from Dwayne, Xavier, other staff in the Department of Community Safety. We've had multiple community engagement sessions. We had a crisis response in the Bull City Town Hall in October. That's what a lot of the reporting back today is going to be about. We've had multiple listening sessions at the IR Holmes Rec Center, at El Centro, and we also have, per Xavier's recent ask, a recommendation that we would like to offer as a first read for our other task force members that hopefully we can circle back to in a minute. Could we move forward into the little charts? Thank you. So this, we don't have demographics, or at least we haven't been able to report back demographics from the listening sessions that happened most recently in December, but in October, this is just a quick snapshot of who joined us for an online town hall. We had more than 100 people register, and it was 2 very, very busy days. This is a breakdown of self-reported age ranges. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a self-reported racial or ethnic background. People generally picked one, so we're treating them as exclusive because that's kind of how people answered. It's slightly imperfect, but hopefully this will give you a sense of who was present at the meeting. Next slide, please. And this is our self-reported gender breakdown. So we had a lot of women and a lot of mothers in the room, but we definitely had people with a lot of different experiences, a lot of different backgrounds, and I'm proud that we were able to get that kind of diversity in the room to hear from them. The numerical data, yes, it does exist, and I would go to Dwayne or Shannon in the Department of Community Safety to get that data, or to ask if the numerical data is available for public distribution.
Shanise.
Hey, all. So for our next session that we did, how are we already keeping each other safe? Our day one agenda continued with that.
Hello. No.
Say hi.
Hi.
Okay, finish cleaning up.
Hi, sweetie.
Where we continue with the opportunity for community members to share various ways in which we in Durham are already keeping each other safe. Town hall participants shared personal stories of neighbors sharing household items, holding regular meetings to build community, getting to know each other, and sharing information relevant to immediate needs and quality of life. With many participants indicated that they use applications such as Nextdoor and WhatsApp. One mentioned that relationships are the technology that we should use to keep each other safe. On a larger scale, other participants uplifted the presence of a robust and multiracial democracy in Durham that keeps us safe, indicated by the creation of this task force. Others noted the many community-rooted elected officials who spend time in the communities that they serve, and take time to get to know our residents. And I will pass it over to Jennifer.
I loved meeting your little resident every time we get together. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to run through a few slides with y'all about some of the other towns that we heard from. There's plenty of great options out there and a growing number, thankfully, but we wanted to hear from organizations or from efforts in other cities to do mobile crisis response that were actually already on the ground. That was a slightly harder task than you might imagine. One, because everybody wants to be Kahoot's best friend right now, and they are very overburdened with requests for their generosity, but also because many other towns are like Durham in the planning stage, still talking about what's going on. And so with the assistance of Ryan in the Department of Community Safety, who did a wonderful job sort of getting a survey of what's out there, we invited representatives from 3 programs: the Denver STAR program, the Street Crisis Response Team in San Francisco, and the Policing Alternatives Division, they changed their name, the Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative, which is in Atlanta. And so a representative from each of these 3 groups came to speak to our town hall participants and to us to kind of share out what they've been doing and give us a sense of what's going on. As a child with ADD, I often found myself going out to dinner with my parents and not knowing what to order because I didn't know what my choices were, and I found that overwhelming. And so we were trying to help people kind of get a sense of that imagination of what their choices were. No, next slide, please. Thank you, Manju. I really appreciate you doing this. So I want to share out some of the logistical and programmatic differences between these programs, because while they're deeply inspiring and we have so much to learn from people who are doing this work on the ground, there's just some practical things that I think are very interesting that make these organizations or make these efforts actually really stand apart. So the first person we heard from was Muki Macias with the Atlanta Policing Alternatives Division, and I got the name wrong because they changed their name, and that's totally my mistake, excuse me. So they began actually as a policing diversion program. So the idea being that someone would be stopped by a police officer and that police officer would initiate diversion at their discretion. They have evolved since then, and their newest initiative is a community-initiated 311 service. This is very much in line with what the National Lead organization is advocating for, saying that if you're going to have diversion to services, every door should be the right door. Everyone should be able to invoke those services. It shouldn't just be a police officer who's able to do that. They developed that 311 service after having multiple community listening sessions, similar to what we're doing, after a community survey, stakeholder meetings, and a thorough review of 3.5 years of 911 call data in Fulton County, where they found that 18% of those calls had the potential for an alternative response. So they're just getting this program off the ground, but in the first 10 months, they have had 747 calls received for service. 290 of those were deemed in need of urgent response to avoid police dispatch. So that's someone who received, like a team got together and went out to them as soon as possible. The remaining 457 were considered non-emergent and were followed up within 24 to 48 hours. So it was someone who needed connection with services, but didn't need a human being right there to provide them with care in that moment. Next slide, please. Thank you, Manju. We also talked to the Denver STAR program. This is more of a crisis response team in the cahoots sort of sense. They have teams that consist of EMTs and behavioral health clinicians. And the way that they have organized this service is that they basically dispatch this team to 9 specific call codes within the 911 or emergency crisis call center. Those specific codes that they defined were assist. Lots of things can fall under assist. It could be anything from like, I locked my dog in my car to my cat is in the tree, lots of different things. Intoxicated person in public, a suicide call, a welfare check, which again could be like, you know, my old neighbor is really lovely and usually comes out and I haven't seen her for 4 days or something like that. Indecent exposure, lots of quality of life crimes, trespass or unwanted person. For them, they said that that was mostly that ended up in being calls that were related to homeless issues or people who were perceived to be disrupting businesses while experiencing homelessness, and then also syringe disposal and harm reduction calls. The other really cool thing about the STAR program is that these teams, when they are out, they are on patrol and they are able to self-direct into providing services. So if they see something happening, like any other first responder, they're able to call in what's happening, pull over and deliver services if they see something emerging. So to date, the STAR team has responded to 1,780 calls with 0 requests for police backup and 0 arrests. And I thought this was interesting to note because once they mentioned this, the folks from Atlanta were like, you know, it's the same thing with us too. They noted that their busiest hours are actually in the early part of the day from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. when business owners are opening up and finding residents sleeping in their doorways. All right, and last but not least, the Street Crisis Response Team in San Francisco. This one is actually quite a bit different. And I think it's important to take into account that this is in San Francisco, which has a lot of very unique concerns to respond to. They also have a lot of really unique services already. So they were trying to fill a gap in services that was really glaring. So these are teams of 3 people. It's a community paramedic, a clinician, broadly defined, and a peer specialist. These teams are in service 24/7, and they have service coverage by neighborhood. So the same people are in the same beat or the same area and get to know local folks. They are dispatched to 800 calls. And so in the call code that San Francisco Emergency Call Center uses, that is a mental health call. So they exclusively respond to mental and behavioral health crisis. And so they were able, because they're looking at these narrow types of call types, not dog stuck in tree, not someone sleeping in my doorway, they were able to do some really interesting assessment of what the disposition or the outcome of these calls were. So they found that when responding to mental health calls, 63% required no transport. And that meant that they were able to triage the situation, de-escalate what was happening, connect with whatever needed to happen. And then that person was able to stay safely within their community. 15% of calls resulted in linkage and transport to services. So that could be transport to a shelter, it could be transport to a harm reduction organization, whatever is needed if transport is indicated. And 15% of calls resulted in transport to a hospital. They did indicate that the remaining 7% ended up in a 5150, which is San Francisco's code for an involuntary psychiatric hold, which is actually a lot lower than these calls were getting in the past. So they're actually keeping a lot of people out of involuntary commitment. So the things, did we move slides? Is this someone else?
I think it makes sense for you to talk about this, Jen. These were just some of the elements from the other cities that Durham residents found most appealing.
Oh, from the mentee. Yes. Oh, thank you. So Manju has been working very hard behind the scenes to make sure we're prepared for today. So I appreciate her deeply. So we used a tool called Mentee to ask people who are in the town hall to highlight what about those presentations stood out to them as really inspiring, really appropriate for Durham. And these are some of the answers. So harm reduction specialists, multiple people mentioned peer support specialists. Although I know that there's a lot of state and federal laws that control our ability to do this. And I still have a lot to learn about how feasible this is in Durham. The idea of using a number other than 911, using a 311 or something like that was really resonated with folks an awful lot. And one that I want to mention on the lower left says elements of the program that recognize unhoused people as community members rather than as problems in the community. They loved how the pace of the services that most community members received was set by the community members themselves, absent high safety concerns. Yeah.
There's 2 more of these, so just to skim through, this is the second of 3.
Yes.
And here's the third of 3.
Thank you, Manju. Yeah, follow-up care, baked in cultural change component, affordable housing help. Great. And so that left us with this set of questions. Sorry, I saw a question come in from Ajay. They attempt to leave people first, or they immediately call for assistance and have, good question. So we didn't get into the details of how those calls play out. Yeah, I think my answer is going to have to be, I don't know. The question is, did Denver or Atlanta mention if the business owners typically attempted to ask people to leave first, or do they immediately call for assistance to have them removed? And our conversation didn't go in that direction, but that's a really good question. So after hearing from not only these other cities' services, but also from people in Durham, we were left with these kind of logistical questions, which we're actively discussing. And I know staff in the Department of Community Safety are actively having, but these are sort of the questions that we need to think about. Yes, there should be imagination. We should be thinking big, but we also have to answer practical questions like who pays for the gas, who's responsible for airing up the tires, things like that. So these are our sort of key questions. So what needs should alternative responders respond to? Should we be limited to really narrow mental health concerns like San Francisco? Should we be broader like Denver and have a series of call codes? Should we be wide like Atlanta and take anything that the community considers worthwhile of calling for help? Who responds? So specifically, what professional skills are needed? Do we need folks with emergency medical skills, social work training, even if they are not licensed social workers, de-escalation skills, mediation skills? What kind of life experience? So do we want folks who have been behavioral health consumers? Do we want folks who have been incarcerated? And what types of representation do we need in those teams to be serving our communities wholly and fully? What services should they be providing there? On-site counseling, needs assessment, emergency medicine, telehealth. Should they pull up the iPad and get on with someone who can start prescribing buprenorphine, start getting you on, ARV, start getting you registered into a shelter, other linkage to care? All these questions are to be answered. How to seek help. Is 911 the only door that people can knock on? Is 911 going to be able to divert a call that they recognize as more appropriate for alternatives somewhere else? Are we going to ask people to call somewhere? Are we going to have all of the above so that people can get to the right place no matter what? That's a tall ask, but those are some of the big options. And where and when? And yes, these are questions, but I think after our conversation today and reflecting upon the deaths that have occurred in our community in recent hours, honestly, I think our first response as a roundtable was like, yeah, we need coverage at 3 a.m. That seems pretty important. So yeah, 24-hour countywide, but clearly there's room to optimize. And that's what we learned from other towns. I'll let my other round table members take over now.
Passing the mic to Isak.
Hey, everybody. Reporting back on our town hall here. We had some time to just listen to the community, asking questions about what people's experiences have been with crisis response or in moments of crisis. So this was a Saturday morning, everybody. Like, people were showing up for this. The session started at 9 a.m. People were there on Zoom and excited to tell stories, courageously telling stories. It was amazing. So I'm just going to highlight a few things, kind of clumping together some of what we heard in this report back. So a lot of the stories, the storytelling talked about how the current response system, which is 911, is with police being dispatched, has not been contributing to safe resolution to crisis situations. Lots of participants talked about how crisis responders in that system just didn't have the skills required to resolve the crisis, the harm that was taking place, and actually exacerbated a tense situation. Several people talked about how responders actually escalated mental health crises to the point of causing harm. Others told stories about how lack of unarmed responders exacerbated trauma and anxiety during intimate partner violence, intimate partner abuse, and how having an officer there with a gun only escalated the situation and made things more unpredictable and therefore dangerous. And then a few people shared stories about how police officers are unable to prevent gun violence since by nature of the situation, they respond after the harm has already been inflicted. So that's the report back from that session. And I don't know who's next.
Was one other session that you also co-facilitated with Shanise around how people made a different choice rather than calling 911? So
yeah, I can, yes, yeah, that's me too, sorry. Yeah, so then there was another session where people told stories about like what worked in terms of moments of crisis. And participants shared about experiences where they actually called friends or got neighbors involved, and even strangers came to intervene and de-escalate conflicts. People shared stories about situations where they called a trusted friend in moments of crisis to provide assistance. In those conversations, there was a collective sense that networks of relationship actually contribute to a safer community.
Thanks, Isak. So I'm Manju, and the session that I helped facilitate was around resident visions. Our crisis response roundtable was really eager to see resident visions for what they wanted the new Department of Community Safety to look like and what they wanted unarmed, compassionate crisis response to look like and how they wanted to experience it. So throughout the town hall, we listened to understand what success would look like and feel like according to them, both in terms of their broad vision and in terms of concrete changes they wanted to see happen. And our final visioning session offered them an opportunity to design what crisis response could look like. We asked what values, characteristics, and skills they'd like to see in their greatest moment of need. And we described a series of common 911 call scenarios, typically handled by Durham police officers or sheriff's deputies. These were scenarios that had been observed during ride-alongs, and we asked residents to describe how they'd like to see those situations addressed in other ways. And here's what we learned. Let me share a different screen. So these were the kinds of skill sets or characteristics folks wanted responders to bring to the scene: de-escalation, violence interruption. In interpersonal communication, they wanted to see change of thought processes around systemic reasons for crime, trauma-informed non-judgmental listening through a harm reduction lens, somatics, compassion, nonviolent de-escalation, conflict mediation. They wanted to see providers who lived in the communities that they served. They wanted to see a calming presence. We heard the training was important around mental health, LGBTQ affirming, deep knowledge of communities, stuff around interpretation, a lot around trauma. In terms of skill sets or characteristics, yeah, more around calming even presence, first aid training, and empathy, the ability to link folks with long-term resources. And then we looked at specific scenarios like this one where a person who's unsheltered, camping outside, dangerously cold weather ahead. And we talked about like, who would you want to see on the team? So the options we offered were paramedic, peer support specialist, mental health clinician or social worker, nurse, law enforcement, none of the above, or someone else. And with the someone else's, we discussed those. So these were some of the scenarios we looked at. We're running short on time, so I won't go over all of the answers, but we were struck by some of the creative team shapes that people described, and struck by the lack of interest in seeing law enforcement on the scene. And these were some of the key images that came to mind when people were picturing a safe Durham community: mutual care, being fed, clothed, sheltered, loved, seen, honored, respected, tranquilidad, people looking out for each other, relief, bienestar, care, compassion, relationships, a lot around relationships and how we care for each other, children not being policed in or out of school, neighbors in conversation, and communication and connection. We loved this one. Smells like a cookout. Mama. So these were some of the kind of top level noticings. No, Mama. These were not all of the insights, but a few highlights were many community members felt like there was, maybe I could ask someone else to share since I have this co-presenter speaking over me.
Yeah, I got you. Okay. So I want to say that I am deeply proud to be working with so many parents. I'm really glad that y'all are able to bring your families to the meeting with you. So as Manju said, these are some of our top level noticings, which is absolutely a term that I have put into my vocabulary since working with this team. So many community members feel that there is little investment in safety and wellness in their communities other than emergency or armed first response. We heard a couple of people say that marked police vehicles moving through their neighborhood is the only sign of financial investment in the area where they live. Many community members also feel that police officers that they have interacted in the past have not offered useful guidance for responding to violence and promoting safety in those neighborhoods. There was one particular anecdote where a woman who had lived in a neighborhood for her entire life came up to an officer who was responding in the aftermath of a violent occurrence. So like the police tape was up and everyone was kind of collecting themselves and asked what she might, if there's anything that she could do. And she received a glib response of probably get a gun. And so I recognize that, you know, our first responders have different skills, but there was, I think, the expectation that there would be more engagement around those very meaningful questions. Community members place value on preventative strategies, even if those preventative strategies target emergent situations like de-escalation, but also things like people talked actually a lot about emotional intelligence and awareness, and you know, even teams that are emergency response teams being involved in like local events, like showing up to the block party and doing like emotions boards with the kids and things. There's some scenarios, and this is important, I think, where specifically, there was a town hall scenario where someone was in a park, open carrying with a firearm. And worth mentioning that firearms are expressly prohibited in Durham parks, despite the fact that we're an open carry state. And in that scenario, some residents were not comfortable with a non-law enforcement response. And really felt that an armed response was needed. So I think that, especially for me, this was a good thing to hear and to recognize when residents are expecting police to show up versus when they need someone to show up and police is who comes anyway. And finally, few community members consider law enforcement agencies to be capable of preventing gun violence, only responding to its aftermath. This was not, this is a good point, it was not understood as a commentary on the talent or resources of local law enforcement, but just an observation about the natural limitations of policing as a public service. I thought that was very, very insightful, the idea that, you know, yes, you can do proactive patrolling, you can make police more visible, but ultimately they were understood as a responsive service and not as a preventative service, and prevention was a very, very high priority for folks.
Looks like that's me. So going to our listening sessions now, and I'll keep this very brief since we have limited time, but I went to the listening session at Centro Hispano, which is here in my neighborhood, in-person meeting, and just a few things to highlight from that time. So this is a listening session about what people wanted in terms of a crisis response and unarmed responders. So one thing that people named that was important was responders who are known in the community. So, you know, somebody that is a trusted member of the neighborhood, not somebody that you've never seen before. And people pointed out that that's never the police or the sheriff's deputies, because they are, citizenship is a requirement to serve as officers. So some ability for these unarmed crisis responders to not necessarily be citizens. Another is that these unarmed responders, that they would be trained professionals. So, you know, talking about, Jennifer already mentioned like financial investment, that like these are people that are like top notch, that are skilled in mental health, first aid care, de-escalation, not aggressive, calming presence. Lots of conversation about what these responders should look like, what they should wear. That came up frequently, a lot of conversation about it. Basically, in summary, just a desire for these people to wear normal clothes with a logo, some identification, but no resemblance to police officers. Thanks.
Thanks, and we'll pop it over to Shanise and Dwayne if you want to add anything about the crisis response listening session at Campus Hills.
I have nothing to add.
Shanise, I can help you out, Shanise. Are you still there? Shanise might have stepped away for a minute. I'm happy to summarize. I think we had about 15 people in the room for this one too, and it was an intergenerational room, all Black participants, all from around the Campus Hills area. And similarly, we presented scenarios, asked folks who should come to help, what do they bring with them, what do they look like, and what does an ideal outcome look like and feel like, and what do you want follow-up to be? Just a few highlights of what we heard. Here's a quote from a participant. "We need a non-911 number. We absolutely don't want law enforcement to be the ones arriving in hot and hollering on this situation, especially if the people in the scenario are Black everybody's screaming, ain't nobody getting their needs met. We need a team of social workers or people with the crisis intervention skills to de-escalate the situation. You don't want someone arriving and escalating the situation when your nerves are already feeling rattled. We heard ideas about having more than one mental health provider arrive at the situation, so at least one mental health support person could face every party involved in the crisis. We talked about needing special vehicles that are safe for transporting people when folks need focused attention. There was an idea about being able to call unarmed crisis responders when the police are harassing people, which wasn't actually a scenario that we had really explored before this listening session. Make sure there are referrals, resources, and a pathway of follow-up sessions that support someone in reaching success. Folks also talked about work they could do in their own communities. How do we repair the structure in our communities for caring for each other's mental health? Like we had an auntie, Bessie May, who we would send family members or neighbors to when folks needed somewhere to cool their head. She always knew what to say to smooth things over. That's what prevents violence and shootings, when we have a safe space where we can get some respite. I grew up in Durham and we knew who we could call to get the community resources we need. Peer support should be proactive, not reactive. There were a lot of creative ideas from young people in the room, especially around finding structured spaces for young people who may not be looking forward to going home, but need somewhere fun and safe to be. They talked about how prisons, jails, military dorms, those are the only current options for structured housing for youth and also adults when home is not a safe place to be. So those are a few highlights. Oh, and then finally our proposal. We have a proposal to share, and it emerged from this, from these series of listening sessions. May I pass the mic to someone else to present this?
Yeah,
do you want to take it, or Jennifer?
Yeah, Isak, did you want to go? Okay, thanks again for being our tech booth in addition to presenting Manju. So as Xavier mentioned earlier, we're presenting this as a quote unquote first read. Essentially, we're giving folks notification. That seems like very formal. We're letting folks know that we've got this in the works and that we want to make a recommendation. And this is the language that we have crafted so far. In brief, it is to begin to staff the 2022-2023 Unarmed Skill Crisis Care Responder pilots, which the Department of Community Safety is actively working on designing in collaboration with the community and with this roundtable by reallocating the 15 Durham Police Department vacancies, FTE positions that were frozen in the city budget last year, over to the Department of Community Safety. And we have a bit of context. If you could scoot forward, Manju, thank you. So this is our language. So the allocation of these FTE or full-time employment roles to the Department of Community Safety is a key step in the implementation of the department's fundamental charter to identify behavioral health crises and other emergent acute community needs that merit skilled unarmed response, and to shift the burden of responding to those emergencies over to novel community-informed mobile crisis response units. So success of the Department of Community Safety and its mission is contingent upon the City of Durham's commitment to dedicating sufficient resources to its activities and expanding DCS capacities through the reallocation of the currently unused resources tied to those 15 FTE positions meets that obligation with with minimum impact to other essential city and community services. These new positions would guarantee that community members can directly access unarmed, skilled, compassionate crisis response through the Department of Community Safety without contributing to the overburden of law enforcement and more efficiently responding to diverse community needs. We anticipate that this would include the creation of an alternative or diversionary dispatch system, something that does not automatically trigger law enforcement response, and 24-hour unarmed crisis response service with maximum coverage during high volume hours from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., which actually are our emergency call center's high coverage hours. We would like to see continued equitable community engagement around the following questions about what unarmed skilled crisis care response should look like. And these are essentially the same questions that I threw on my slide. Who goes out? What are they offering? Where are they going? When are they going? What is triggering those services? How will they get there? How will they be dispatched? We have a lot of great material from the listening sessions that we just described, and we just want to be sure that we continue to keep in very, very close communication with the community while we do that. Yes.
And that's all. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And thanks so much to all the community participants who informed all of what we just shared.
Yeah, and I anticipate we'll be
really valuable and meaningful, and it means the world to us.
I also would say I anticipate we're going to be in communication with our chairs and possibly with the department staff about circulating this text over email to folks so that you can access it over the next several days, somewhere besides YouTube.
Absolutely. You're referring to the recommendation, Jennifer? Yeah, we'll make sure that gets available. And of course, this entire recording will be available shortly, of course, on the city website. I do want to mention that the town halls that they referred to those videos are already on our website under city meetings and events. And we would love to get that PowerPoint if we can think about that PowerPoint information as well. But thank you again for this roundtable, all the work you've been doing. To work that all the roundtables have been doing. Appreciate you guys staying over a few minutes. Again, that was a first read, which, as we see this as a first draft, we will talk about it and see how we want to move it forward when we meet again. By way of announcements, because we started in late August, early May of 2021, we are already coming up at the end of our third quarter of work. And of course, when I say that to you as task force members, that means, oh no, a report. We're going to make this third report pretty simple. I was looking over our emails, see if we had sent out the information, and I realized it was during one of those meetings where Dwayne and Marcia and I were probably all driving. I don't think anybody took notes, so it's going to be pretty simple. We want you to make sure that you develop within your roundtables a timeline of your work through December, as much as you can. To try to anticipate any possible recommendations that may be coming forth, knowing that it would take a 2 months first and second reading, and then just talking about anything that you've done since October, November, December. So, sorry, November, December, and January. So you'll get an email from me. Again, I don't think we sent one out with that information, so I want to put it in your brains and in your minds, top of your minds. Also, just by way of announcements, a couple of meetings ago, earlier, I guess late summer, we talked about, we applauded Ajane Clemens on receiving her doctorate and her appointment to the University of Denver. Here at the beginning of this year, we are happy to announce that she's a newlywed. So congratulations, Ajane. We're all very excited for you. Marcia?
Yes, congratulations to you and Peter, Ajane. We're over time, so I think I will just say goodbye for all of us. And I bet you're hungry. I sure am. And thanks so much. I want to do a special thanks to Crisis Response. That was a wonderful presentation, extremely helpful. And and everything I said about belonging, it was in there, right? That's how we're safe, is when we are in loving and respectful relationship to one another. And with that, I just can hardly wait to see you next month. And blessings to you all.
Hey, sorry, Marcia, can I say something real quick?
Certainly.
So we are discussing the staffing for community safety at our next work session. I just wanted folks to know the timeline.
Okay.
So if there was going to be an official recommendation from the task force, it would have to happen before Thursday, which is
Of next
a
week.
pretty quick turnaround. Yeah, next Thursday.
Next Thursday. Okay.
And
Thank
the
you.
material for those, for the agenda and all the material for that will be available to the public Friday of this week, which is the same time that it's available to council members.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
if anyone wants to set up time, because you have questions, we haven't seen it either, so I'm just saying this blindly. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to email me or Jillian, and we will hopefully be able to, or I can commit to trying to set up time on Zoom with any folks.
Great. Thank you. Until tomorrow. Y'all. Thanks again and good night.